Welcome to Protective Presence USA, the podcast, a podcast that offers English listeners a window into the Protective Presence movement and the reality in the West Bank that makes that activism necessary. On this episode of the podcast, Amit Orfali and I, Celeste Marcus, have the great pleasure and honor of speaking with Rabbi Arik Ascherman, who is one of the founders of the Protective Presence movement. He's been involved in protective presence and in activism in general in Israel for 30 years. And in this conversation, we get to talk with him about how the activism that he does has changed over the last several decades, and also about how he got involved in the first place. But we get to also talk with him about how his Jewish faith brought him to this place in his life and to this position of leadership in our world, and about how his Judaism relates to the Judaism of the settlers and of the Israeli government that he's working so hard to oppose. It's a fascinating conversation, and I hope you listen to it, and I hope you share it with others.
I've been leading Israeli human rights organizations for now 31 years. That's not just Protective Presence. Protective Presence has been off and on, depending on how you define it. But let's say in the late 90s, a lot of our work was standing in front of bulldozers to prevent home demolitions. Starting in 2002, a lot of our work was accompanying olive farmers. And then there have been periods starting in 2016 or 17, accompanying shepherds. And in various periods, there's also been protecting communities. In 2018, it was Khan al-Ahmar and Susia. And now, of course, it's what we're doing along the Alon Road. And that's all alongside the other work that we do for economic justice for Israelis, for example, or in the Negev for Negev Bedouin. And there's, a lot of things could be considered protective presence, I suppose, including barricading ourselves in homes of Israelis who are about to be evicted from their public housing homes and this kind of thing.
Mm. So can we rewind a little bit farther back and talk about how you're American, I assume?
Yes.
And did you spend a lot of time in Israel growing up? Did you know how did this trajectory begin as an American?
Well, let's say that what I learned from a very young age from my parents, from my rabbis, from my teachers, from my community, was that a basic part of what it means to be a Jew, arguably a human being, is to be concerned with what we now call tikkun olam, being God's partners in the ongoing work of creation, almost the repairing and sanctifying of the world. We didn't use the term back when I was young, but that was the idea. And I would say that there was also a strong connection with Israel, my home. I didn't really visit until much later, but it was always there in the community. And it's very, I remember when the Yom Kippur War broke out, and I grew up in a synagogue where, unlike many, many U.S. synagogues, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are not big fundraising opportunities. And it was so dramatic when our rabbi got up and said, "We never do this, but there's an emergency now, and now we have to raise money." And another secret from my past, believe it or not, is I in high school played American football, which is kind of an exaggeration because I was almost in 4 years. I don't think I was in the game for 4 plays, but I wasn't much of a football player. But when we come back from practice, when the Yom Kippur War was going on, and the first thing in the carpool, I would ask whoever was driving to turn on the radio to hear what the news was. And then that was in 9th grade. And when I graduated, people remembered this because they couldn't understand why a kid halfway around the world would be concerned what was happening in Israel. Certainly by bar mitzvah age, I was, I knew I wanted to be a rabbi from about age 6 or 7. By age 13, I certainly felt that my rabbinate would have a lot to do with issues of social justice. And then I got very involved in political activities in college, university, anti-apartheid work. And I would have a lot of debates with one of my roommates about Zionism. And I didn't consider myself a Zionist. And had nothing to do with Palestinians. It simply had to do with the fact that I didn't think then, as I didn't think now, that all Jews need to live in the land of Israel. And then I read through Arthur Hertzberg's The Zionist Idea.
Is that the reader?
And I understood that there were many different threads of Zionism, some of which I find repugnant and racist, others with which I very much identify. The common thread being arguably that part of the solution to the oppression of Jewish people for thousands of years is to again be control over in control of our destiny in our homeland. And I said, okay, so maybe I'll retire there someday. And I thought I was going straight from university to rabbinical school. But God had some other ideas. I wasn't accepted. I was told to apply to Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. I was told they would want you to reapply, but you're not ready. You can't just go from school to school to school. You got to go out and do something in the world first. And that was painful, but like many things in my life, sometimes a painful slamming of a door guided me through the door that I was supposed to go through. And I had heard about a program called Interns for Peace, which was a program for Israeli Jews and Palestinians and Jews from outside the country like myself. And in the framework of that, I lived in an Israeli Palestinian village in the Galilee for almost 2 years and a year and a half. And we were doing community work to try to promote coexistence between Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians. And it was that was when I decided that my life was going to be here. In other words, I began to have a sense of community with people that were doing similar kinds of things. And I also began to feel that if I couldn't make my contribution to Tikkun Olam here, where we have a common language, where we can have terrible arguments, but still be around what are Jewish values, what does it mean to have a state, and all these kinds of things, then where am I going to do it? And so from that point on, it was simply preparing myself to come back here in some way. I did get into rabbinical school. I met my partner who was a third generation Israeli and would never live anywhere else. So that was kind of like icing on the cake. I was going to be here. And then we spent, in 1989, we were both ordained and married, and she started a doctorate at Stanford. And when she finished in 1994 and not finished her residency requirements, we came back. And luckily, the year after, the position opened for the rabbis for human rights, a quarter-time position. But that's the way it started, and then the rest was history, I guess.
Okay, so you've said already that Protective Presence wasn't exactly the program that it started with, and that there were other forms of activism that you were doing that sort of acclimated you into the community as well. But when you started, was the format for Protective Presence the way that we understand it now? Like Amit and I have both done it. Amit much more than I have. Did it look that way? And in the 90s, what were the biggest differences that you've seen develop over time doing this work, both in the Palestinian communities and also mainstream Israeli culture's relationship to the kind of activism that you were doing? Sorry, Amit, do you want to ask a question also?
Everything really depended on the needs of the time. What needed to be done, maybe in the late 90s, I would really characterize as civil disobedience. We were standing in front of bulldozers coming to demolish homes, and we were rebuilding homes that had been demolished. And then when the Second Intifada started, we were literally sometimes dismantling roadblocks that the Israeli army had set up to blockade Palestinian families within or communities within their homes. So it was a lot of, as I said, civil disobedience. And alongside that, there was always the component of protective presence in the sense of trying to just be with communities that were in danger. Although it was only off and on, as I said, when there was very clear and direct danger, that we would get to the point of actually trying to be in a place 24/7 or something like that, which is a big piece of what protective presence has become. I mean, even when we were accompanying olive farmers or shepherds, it wasn't 24/7 as it is now in certain places. The current round of protective presence, from my point of view, began in May of 2023, really. And I would say that between May and August of 2020, I mean, there was already Ras Al-Tin, a shepherding community that disappeared, that fled, reports out of their homes in 2022. But between May and August of 2023, 3 communities fled state-backed settler violence. The first being in Samia, and then there was El Baka and Kabun. Watching these communities and feeling very responsible for what had happened in these communities in different ways. I mean, in each one of them, I felt personal responsibility, especially in Sami and El Baka. And in Sami, it was a community that we'd done accompanying shepherds, and then they said they didn't really need us, and I would stay in touch with them, but they did need us, and they just wasn't fully communicating that. And ironically, The day that the event happened, which was a straw that broke the camel's back, I had called, and one of my contact people, I was passing by, but the person couldn't talk to me. And the reason he couldn't talk and he couldn't communicate me, and if I had heard what he was saying, maybe I would have been able to intervene, was that the police were confiscating one of their flocks. The night before, as so often happened, nearby settlers had traipsed through, supposedly looking for some of their sheep. They didn't find anything, they left. But the next day, without any due process, a police officer saw one of the shepherds grazing along the street, along the road, and decided that this was a stolen flock, called up the settlers and told them just to come and take their sheep.
Wow.
And and what people said afterwards was the two most important things in our lives are our children, who are getting always attacked and there's stones on them, everything, and our flocks. And if the state can, in such an arbitrarily and unjust way, just simply take a flock. And by the way, I've learned one thing I've learned in 31 years is never to believe anybody without corroboration. So I don't just automatically assume that it wasn't true that this was a stolen flock. But the only thing I can say is, even so, there would have to be due process. And B, if a shepherd, knowing they were looking for a stolen sheep, was actually grazing along a main road with a stolen flock the next day, he should be arrested for the crime of stupidity. All right. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. But they said is we can fight the violence, we can withstand the violence, we try to hang on. Although the community had already been gradually widowing down, but we can't fight the state's power, and so they left.
So, Arik, you said so many interesting things about protective presence, but I think we'll continue with the power of the state. Would you, from your experience, tell us how it changed, how the state does it intervene more in the ethnic cleansing process right now than 20 years ago?
Let me just say two things, and I'll get to that. I just want to say that Obaka was a case where they also they asked for our presence after a home had been burned, and we were there for a couple of days. And then I said, "It's okay. We don't have the capacity." And they said it was okay if we're not there all the time, but it wasn't okay. And they started leaving. And I'll get back to that because one of the things that just really impacted on my conscience was that we hadn't been there when we should have been there, because we said we didn't have the capacity. And when after the third community disappeared, and I was in debates with people that said we don't have the capacity to do 24/7. Everybody said we can't do it. So that can't be in our lexicon. When the communities are disappearing, not being able to do it is not an option, just not an option. In terms of your question, Amit, you know that ever since 1967, in one way or another, the state of Israel has been backing the occupation and more intensively, more actively backing settlement growth and expansion, sometimes less intensively, but always to some degree. And we who are veterans in the human rights community have always been very hesitant to use phrases like "it's never been so bad," because it's always been bad at some level. All right. But there was a meeting. We were having a meeting of some of the more veteran Israeli human rights NGO staffers in the spring of 2023. Of course, the current government was elected or took office in January of 2023. And we all just kind of looked at each other and said, well, it's really never been so bad. And, I think that in Israel, although there's always been human rights violations from the founding of the state or even before, there was always a veneer that the public ethos was international human rights, was justice. Look at the wording of our Declaration of Independence, for example. What was Bezalel Smotrich, one of his campaign slogans in the last election? You vote for me and you know what you're getting. So the veneer was gone. People knew they were voting for racism, expansionism, homophobia, misogyny, whatever, neo-liberalism, all these kinds of things. And still a minority, but a significant minority of Israelis voted knowing just what they were getting. And that is an indication of what the current government has been imposed, and why it is true that we've always had this support, but it's now just took a different level, and now even more so recently. I say that if there's always been settler violence against Palestinians, and there's always been army violence against Palestinians, and there's always been state support, not letting people build legally and then demolishing their homes. All these things are not new. But we've reached a level where the support of security forces, not just for the settlements, but for settler violence, is just open in an overtop the way that I don't remember in 31 years. And I'll just give one example, and I could give many. But if I look at the village of Mukhmas in the Bedouin neighborhood of Khalat Sidra, they survived pogroms where settlers came and burned homes and injured our volunteers. One of our volunteers got out of home just before she was burned alive, and all these things. And they said, as long as you're with us, we can hang on. And then we've had a series in Duma Marajim, in Jaba, in Taibe, in Mukhmas, where long-term, even like year-long military closures have been imposed, which would be a good thing if they were actually used to keep settlers from coming and harassing Palestinians. But when in time after time, we are openly told, not even hiding it, that we're going to enforce this against you and not against the settlers, it's not only is it not protecting Palestinians, it's removing whatever protection we can give to open the door for more settler violence. Okay. And then after the first pogrom on October 25th, we helped people and they were building their homes quietly. But on January 17th, after another pogrom, and then the army came in and said, you can't rebuild the homes that the settlers have burned. And then they put a roadblock between the Bedouin neighborhood and the rest of the village. And then just a few weeks ago, they came and demolished the homes that we had started to rebuild before that we were stopped. And when asked why, well, there was nobody living there. Well, yes, they weren't living there because they couldn't live there because you created the conditions which made it impossible for them to be there. And so we are seeing that. And now as the next election is coming up, it seems it's just getting worse and worse. My guess is that the ruling coalition, the current coalition, realizing that they might lose, although no one knows what will happen, wants to create as many more facts on the ground as possible, and they want to get more votes by playing to their base. And so we're looking at just yet another upping of the level of settler violence and clearing all roadblocks from the building of or allowing of more and more outposts. On several occasions, the commander for the West Bank, the army commander of the West Bank, Avi Blut, has on the one hand said it's a minor miracle that there isn't more Palestinian violence right now in reaction to settler violence. And he also says, though, that how proud he is that of all the scads and scads of outposts, that there's some 150 outposts illegal according to the state of Israel, let alone international law, which he says we're supporting. And there's a whole discussion within Israel discourse today between, you talk about chavot and gvaot. So the gvaot are the hilltop wildcat outposts, which are the bad outposts. And the chavot are the ones where you kind of wink and turn and actually support them. All right. And that is simply part of the reality. It's also true, by the way, in 31 years, I don't recall any time ever when there was as much discussion of settler violence and condemnation of settler violence in Israeli public discourse, and not just from the usual suspects. I mean, former Likud ministers like Dan Maridor and Meir Shetrit were part of an ad talking about settler pogroms as war crimes being supported passively or actively by the army and is responsible to the government. You even have settler rabbis sometimes talking about settler violence. You have President Herzog talking about it. Though they try to minimize and try to portray it as just a handful of troubled youth, and there are troubled youth, but it's much wider and broader and state supported than that. And then, for all the discussion, and here's also something interesting. In the past, when people have gotten upset about settler violence, it was usually when the Golem Kama Yitzro, The golem is in Jewish tradition like our version of the Frankenstein's monster, which eventually turns on its creators. And so when settlers start to attack the army and police, then people get upset. But now people are generally seem to be upset about settler violence. But all of that, it is not translating into change on the ground in any way at all up till now.
Well, Arik, I want to ask you, in light of all of this worsening, but the public discussion supporting protective presence and opposing settler violence, I'm sure you can tell us a lot about how important it is to be on the ground. But I want to ask you, how effective is it, both in terms of standing up to settlers and discussing the authorities and of course the aspect of solidarity with the Palestinians? How effective and significant it is to be on the ground?
As you know, I've sometimes tried to initiate discussions, even among our human rights defenders, not simply continuing automatically to do protective presence the way we've done it as things change. When we did actually get one of these long-term military closure orders canceled under threat of legal challenge, the one in Duma Marajam, but we don't really have a good solution yet. And that does call into question how we can do protective presence when the army has this tool to just make sure we can't be there. So that's always, and I'm going to say something and the opposite, almost. But ultimately, I want to be effective. I don't want to do things just because it's the right thing. It's a sap for my conscience or our conscience. And I don't think we should be giving ourselves a pat on the shoulder just because we're in solidarity. And we always have to be asking, are we really being effective, and can we be more effective? One of the favorite settler taunts, I heard it today by a settler: every place you show up, the Palestinians end up having to leave. You guys actually make things worse for them. And of course, my answer is, that's just, you're focusing on, there are sadly places where we were trying to defend and they're no longer there. But you're ignoring all the places. How many more places would be gone if we weren't doing what we're doing? And I really believe that. In other words, there's no sugarcoating the fact that there's places where we've failed, and the communities, despite all our efforts, have fled or been forced out at gunpoint sometimes. But there are communities and people who are in their homes today because of what we're doing. All right. And on the one hand, I give so much credit to the bravery and determination, the tzumud of those Palestinians doing everything they can to stay in their homes. But they often say to us, if you weren't here with us, we would not be able to stay. And so at some level, we have been effective. And although we shouldn't be giving ourselves a pat in the back, realizing where we haven't been successful, and we have to thinking how we can do what we're doing better, we always have to be thinking. And at the same time, and you've heard me say this before, when I speak with Palestinians, or for that matter, with Israeli Jews in danger of losing their public housing, I often quote the Midrash about the parting of the sea, which of course also appears in the Quran. And in that story, God says, after God says, the people are in fear and they're crying and they're screaming, Moses, go do something, go talk to God. The seas in front of us, the army's behind us, Pharaoh's army's behind us. And God says to Moses, why are you talking to me? Go forward. And then the rabbis take that a step further. They say that God did not part the sea until all the children of Israel jumped into the water. And then there's a debate whether they had to jump in up into their neck or up to their noses. Okay. And I tell that story to say that it's so easy to understand why it all seems hopeless. What's the point of filing another police complaint when we know that the police just close these complaints left and right, and so on and so forth? But you have to try to do everything possible. God helps those who help themselves. We even know in our tradition the name of the first person who jumped into the water and led everybody else, Nachshon ben Aminadav. But then there's something else I say. I will not give you kalam fati. I will not make empty promises that I cannot keep. I cannot promise you that if we just do A, B, and C, we're going to save your homes. We're going to stop the violence. We're going to save your trees, whatever. I can promise we'll do our best. We'll try everything we can, but I can't promise success. The one thing I can promise is that whatever happens, come what may, you will not be alone. When I think of all the times in Jewish history throughout the dark centuries, when we were alone, when our doors were busted down in the middle of the night, and what we would have given to not be alone, I say, that's the one thing I will promise you. You will not be alone. And for that also, by the way, I need the help of the people who are listening to this podcast. Because sadly, I really, truly wish that we Israelis would handle this on our own. If 1% of all the Israelis who say they support international law, they believe in human rights, they are against the occupation, if 1% of them would give us one shift a month instead of the current situation where we are desperately trying to find 2 or 3 people to be in a community and only a handful of all the communities that need us, we would have what is my vision of having 20 people 24/7 in all these communities until the army would probably try to find some other way to block us or whatever. But we don't have that. And that's why we have been now bringing people from abroad. And I think the listeners can receive the link for how to apply. And we have, on the average, a couple people a month doing that. I wish we had more. But it's a real invitation. I think that whether you're sitting in Tel Aviv or New York or Buenos Aires or wherever, it's not just enough, unfortunately, to say, tisk, tisk, isn't it terrible? Isn't this all wrong? The question is, what are we going to do in a concrete and effective way to try to make things better?
Yeah. And in addition to the fact that you can have a real influence by doing this work, you can also have a real influence by talking about it, which is another reason that people from all over the world should come.
Exactly. Those things are connected, because it's one thing to get up on your soapbox and say what you think about Palestinian human rights. It's a totally different ballgame when you say, this is what I've experienced. This is what I've seen. I'm not just giving you my 2 cents. And it makes you a much more effective advocate going home when you've been here and actually been involved.
I want to ask, as you just said, the experience of doing protective presence is absolutely life-changing, and you can't go back to the way that your life was after you've done it. It's a transformative experience. And that's true for Israelis who do it, whose lives get completely overrun by just the fact of it. But it's also true for people who are not Israeli who come and do it. But I am curious, again, I want to raise the question that I raised earlier, because you have mentioned now that there are, President Herzog made public statements about the settler terrorism, and you signed a letter along with many other people, including former prime ministers and also Rav Lichtenstein, and I wondered if you could talk about that letter and about mainstream Israeli perception, which you've touched on a little bit about. You've said if there was just 1%, people would come. But I mean mainstream Israelis, and then also the liberal camp, which we can say like the judicial overhaul protests are like the cross section of Israeli society that I'm talking about. How do they think about settler terrorism and about your activism?
And I just want to up Celeste's question and also ask about how do they feel about the sponsorship of the state to this settler terrorism?
Those are very interesting questions. I often say, for most of the 31 years I've been doing this, I've never felt marginalized. I've always felt I'm very much a part of Israeli society, and we are. Sometimes with more support, sometimes with less support. And that changed very drastically after the October 7th massacre. The best analogy I can give is it's like, Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. How many U.S. citizens stood with Japanese Americans when they were put in camps after Pearl Harbor? It was only 40 years later that the U.S. administration started to apologize and offer compensation and said what we did was a combination of racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And for all the perhaps analogies only go so far. I think those are very apt words. And so we went through a real dismal period where even people that had showed concern at some level, again, even if they were only talking a talk without walking the walk, were no longer interested in Palestinians, or they were angry with the Palestinians, or they agreed that all Palestinians, are terrorists or potential terrorists, and all these kinds of things. And there's been some recovery. And I think what you see with all these statements is the fact that some people are kind of coming to their senses again to some level. But at the same time, as I already said, it's being done in a way to minimize the full reality of what this really is. They are willing to talk about a handful of troubled youth. They are much less willing to talk about state-sponsored terrorism, state-sponsored violence. And again, and then you've got some people like Dan Maridor and Mayor Shatrin and others who are saying those things, although they aren't the usual suspects. But again, it still remains to be seen whether that's going to translate into any kind of real change. I mean, Palestinians often ask me, what can we expect of the upcoming elections? And of course, as a human rights organization, it's beyond our mandate to support any party. We can also talk about the end of the occupation, but we can't support any one particular final status, solution or something. That's beyond our mandate as a human rights organization. But what I tell people, though, just as for my analysis, is if there is a change in government, things will be better, but not good. Because we can imagine a new government that will stop the attacks on the judiciary. And of course, the judiciary has actually, in fact, failed us more than it's served us, although it has sometimes served. It has sometimes done the right thing, but all too often, clearly more often it is not. I feel a little bit spoiled because we've won some major high court victories that were really important. There may be a stronger attempt to curb settler violence, slow the outgrowth of outposts, but there's no possible coalition that will have the will to reverse what's been done. It's just not going to happen without some kind of very serious international pressure. And I don't have much faith in the international community, I have to say. The international community has consistently shown no backbone. And I think people that somehow think that the international community is going to save us have pipe dreams. I hope I'm wrong. We try it. We lobby the international community. We don't give up on any of it and do the right thing and save us.
I'm just curious to know what the policy proposals are that you have for an EU government, or in my own case, an American administration.
Well, it would start with cutting off sources of funding for human rights violations coming from, all the money that's going to the settler organizations and what have you. I'm not in favor of cutting off all funding to Israel. I don't want our survival to be in question. For example, if we're talking about the United States, where I neither want Israel to be singled out nor coddled, we have something like the Leahy Law. The Leahy Law, it's not just for Israel, it's for any country in the world. And it says very clearly, U.S. military hardware cannot go to be used for human rights violations. That's pretty, so that's kind of my ideal of a principle for any country in the world, but be enforced against Israel as well. Under the first Trump administration, there was somebody in the State Department that came to me and said that they knew that the Israeli ambassador, who had a direct line to Trump and could just bypass the State Department, had said basically, why should we go all the unpleasantness of making Israel do the Leahy Law reporting that everybody else in the world has to do? We know we're not going to stop. We're not going to cut off funding, so or stop the military hardware. So why go through all this? Now, the fact is, I think there are plenty of other countries who maybe do fill out the Leahy, and we're still getting hardware and using it for human rights violations. But and then when finally there was something about that finally published in Political magazine or something like this, and nobody really blinked an eye. I mean, it's like, but in other words, I don't want Israel singled out unfairly, but neither do I want Israel coddled unfairly.
Arik, I want to go back to the topic of Israeli society and specifically religion. You said you speak a lot about tikkun olam, and this is the reason you started doing human rights work. But many Israelis, including religious figures and leaders, use the same scripture, the same Judaism to justify the ethnic cleansing, to justify crimes and the occupation. What is your response to them?
I so wish that I could conclusively prove that my way of understanding Judaism is the only correct way, and I can't do that. They have their sources, we have our sources. The struggle is to show where so many Israelis think that even if they're not religious, that is the true religion, that the way we understand Judaism is no less based on Jewish sources and tradition than the people that are using it for all these nefarious goals. There are days when I wake up and say, John Lennon was right. We'd better be better off in a world without religion and without nationalism. And if I want to be honest, I have to say that religion has been on the wrong side of history more often than it's been on the right side of history. But being a person of faith, and faith not being something I could just turn on and off like a light bulb, what remains is to fight for the soul of my religion, of Judaism and for our people. And the other thing is, many years ago, I was at a conference that was co-sponsored by the Norwegian Foreign Ministry and a local Norwegian peace organization. And the premise was that the premise had been in the civil society for many, many years that if you're going to solve thorny problems, you got to keep religion out of it. Religion is too unreasonable, too intractable, too dogmatic. And the only way you're going to solve serious problems is by keeping religion out of it. But the reason for this conference, and they brought religious leaders from several hot conflict areas, is that it doesn't work. Religion is too powerful a force in human society. And you can't do an end around it. You can't. And therefore, it doesn't work to simply try to do an end around Judaism. We have to fight for Judaism, which is a God that I believe in. It's not something I'm making up. It's a God I believe in. It's a God I've experienced in my life, and it's in our sources. It's not the only thing one can find in our sources, but it's there. Starting from the very first chapter of the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 27, human beings are created in God's image. It doesn't say just the Jews. It doesn't say just the wealthy. And it makes a point of saying both men and women. And how you try to deal with that verse, I can then kind of predict where you're going to be on just about anything else. Because if you believe that human beings are created in God's image, then that requires that brings with it obligations, including respecting every human being's human rights. One of the things that I've learned over the years is that the danger of idolatry is in good things. There aren't that many people out there today, as far as I know, worshiping golden calves. Gold, maybe. Power, maybe. That's even become cliche. But I get moved to tears sometimes when I see a flag or hear a national anthem. And because I know how those things impact me, I know how dangerous they can be. Again, in the United States and Canada, maybe other places in the world, we have this custom that in synagogues, and also in churches, but in synagogues for now, on either side of the Aron, the ark where you keep the Torah scrolls, you have flags. One side the U.S. or Canadian flag, and the other the Israeli flag. And when I was a congregational rabbi, I said, no flags. We worship God here, all right? Not flags, not countries. And, put it somewhere else, but not in the sanctuary. And the land of Israel is holy. If you take the Bible seriously, you can't write that out. You can't write out that God promised it to the Jewish people. You can't write out that it's almost like a living being. And you can't write out that when evil or wrong things are done upon it, it will spit you out, including the Jews. So many of the settlers are blinded by two things. They're blinded by they're scarred by the oppression of Jews for thousands of years, and they're blinded by the holiness of the land of Israel, to the point where they can't see God where God exists in fellow human beings. And when you put the land of Israel, as holy as it is, raise it above that Palestinian shepherd or farmer who is created in God's image. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the great rabbis of the 20th century, and when he would speak out against racism, would say, as iconoclastic as the Torah is, the Bible is about not allowing the image of God, there is an image of God in the Torah. It's a human being. So when you put that land above the human being, that's idolatry. That's simply idolatry. And regarding the scars on our souls, an important rabbi of the 19th century, Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who wrote an extensive Torah commentary. I don't know if any of you know what the most repeated command in the Torah is. It's about how we treat the non-Jew living among us. God already figured out way back then that it's going to be the most difficult thing to obey, and so I'm repeating it. And on one of those places where it appears, he says the following: Toevat Mitzrayim, the abomination of Egypt, is simply this. They believed, as all the peoples of the time did, and I would say still do, that might makes right. And because they had absolute power over us, they had the right to do with us what they wanted, to enslave us, to embitter our lives. And speaking in the 19th century, several decades before Theodor Herzl, before the advent of political Zionism, he says the Torah is predicting that, thank God, we're going to have a state someday. But the Torah is warning us, he says, when the power will be in your hands, the power you suffered because you didn't have for thousands of years, the power you craved in an understandable way, you must not use that power that you will have the way the Egyptians use it against us. Now, that's a tough ask. The psychologists tell us that those who were beaten as children are more likely to beat their own children. And we were beaten a lot for 2,000 years. It's almost human nature then to try to repeat learned behaviors like that. But the Torah says no. The Torah is saying we have to be different. We haven't succeeded up to now, but that's from my Torah that I believe in. The God I believe in is telling us that we must be different.
I think that's a really good place to end. Thank you so much. As soon as I have edited it and it's up, I'll send you the link, Arik.
Thank you so much. Maybe I'll just two other brief things.
Please.
The first is, as difficult it is, I could not continue to do what I do if I still didn't believe in the goodness and decency for my fellow Israelis. You know, back to my football days, we had an amazing coach who would scream and try, and we had an amazing winning streak. And we said, I only shout at the people I can make into better football players. And in all the years, he never shouted at me once. There was no point. There was nothing he could have done.
Well, Arik, I hope you don't have to use your football skills in protective presence, tackle someone or...
You'd be surprised. I don't necessarily tackle people, but sometimes I do use football skills dodging and running around settlers. But when we try and when we protest and when we write our op-eds and we do our legal work and we do the protective presence, it's an act of faith because, at least for me, because if I didn't, I said it already at the outset, I want to be effective. I don't want to do these things just to make myself feel better. And if I didn't have some faith in my fellow Israelis that things can be changed, it would just seem like my football coach trying to shout at me, which would have been a waste of time. And the last thing I want to say, to be an activist, you have to have a predilection for beating your head against the wall. But every once in a while, the wall cracks. And I've seen that in my life. I've seen that in examples. We've seen that in history in so many times. And our tradition teaches us to look at all of life as two perfectly balanced scales. You never know what little act you may take. It seems pointless, irrelevant, ineffective at the time. But that will be the act that tips those perfectly balanced scales on the personal and cosmic levels one way or the other. It's a burden because you can't just take time off, but it's also the hope and the promise. And so my hope and wish and parting prayer and blessing for all of us, whether it be the Middle East or any of the other spheres of our personal and public and spiritual lives, so we should always have the courage and the wisdom and the faith to tip those scales in the right direction. May it be God's will. Inshallah. Ken Yeh Ratzon.
Thank you so much, Arik. Thank you for this inspiring talk, and I hope you managed to influence some of our listeners to join Protective Presence.
That doesn't work. We should give up.